Hello everybody and welcome to the National Museum for this evening's panel discussion. My name is Kirsten Wehner. I'm the James O. Fairfax Senior Fellow in Culture and Environment here at the National Museum of Australia. And it's my very great pleasure to be able to facilitate, if you like that word, facilitate this evening's discussion. The future is now regenerating our waters. I feel like I have to say a very special thank you for you all to coming along this evening. I know it's been a bit of a strange time, particularly between the public holiday and the weekend. So thank you for coming along on this Friday evening. So I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the country in which we're meeting, the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I particularly like to do that in the spirit of thinking about traditional custodians' relationships with, knowledge of, and care for waterways. Over the last few months, I've had the privilege of walking a number of Canberra's creeks with Ngunnawal custodians, and that's been an amazing experience of understanding the significance of the flow of water, of waterway communities, of rivers and creeks and wetlands in Indigenous First Nations lives and histories and futures. And I really want to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging in the spirit of expressing thanks and really respect for that deep knowledge and how that can help us inform how to care for our waterways into the future. I haven't had the same privilege to date with oceanic water, but that's something I'm certainly looking forward to very much. I'm going to introduce our wonderful panel in a minute, and I should note that 3 of our panel are here in person, and 1 is in Victoria, Helen Barclay, but she's going to be joining us online through the magic of the internet. Poor old Helen has 2, there she is, 2 small children and a good case of the flu. So much wiser for Helen to join us online, but I thank her for managing to get through the technical kind of shenanigans today. So I'm going to introduce the panel in a minute, but I just wanted to say a few words about tonight's themes and why we're gathering today. As you know, one of the National Museum's key roles is to build community understanding and engagement with the key challenges of our time. This is really important for my role here at the museum, which is to focus on ecological transformation in the era of climate action and how we can come together for cultural and environmental regeneration. Tonight's panel is about how people from a wide range of fields of endeavour are working at this, what I think is a really pivotal moment in the Earth's history. How people are coming together from different disciplines, different backgrounds, different bodies of knowledge, different approaches, to build new ideas, technologies and communities of actions that address the intersection between climate change and plant, animal, insect and fungi extinctions that are unfolding across our continent and indeed across the world. We're asking, how can we think in new ways? How can we find out new approaches in order to regenerate our world? We know that we need to rapidly decarbonise our societies, developing clean energy, reshaping agriculture and transport, and reimagining how we live. But we're also becoming increasingly aware that it's not enough to simply talk about reducing emissions. We need to also attend to how global temperature rise is joining with widespread habitat loss to accelerate species decline. The good news is, of course, is that this is all a time to come together and look for opportunities, to discover how we can draw together and act on the great bodies of knowledge that we already have and can develop. First Nations, knowledges and unique perspectives, scientific research, technological innovation, policy development and cultural transformation. Bringing these together can help enable biodiverse ecosystems to regenerate and flourish, helping mitigate climate impacts and securing a beautiful world for us and everybody else that lives on the planet into the future. Just over a week ago, the National Museum opened the Great Southern Land Gallery, a major new initiative telling stories of how natural forces and life communities, including their peoples, have created this incredibly diverse and resilient continent. and I do hope you'll take some time to have a look at it just outside the door on another day. Tonight's panel picks up on one of Great Southern Land's themes, the flows of water that are foundational to all life, and that in both the inland and the oceans are themselves diverse biological and cultural communities. And I'm really delighted that we're going to be considering this flow of water across the oceanic divide, looking at what is happening both globally and locally. So more than enough from me. It's my great pleasure this evening to introduce our panellists. Just to my right is Her Excellency Vicky Tredal, CMG, MVO, British High Commissioner to Australia. And Vicky tells me that her day started at about 7:30 this morning, heading off to the House of Representatives, so we very much appreciate you sticking with it and kind of making it this evening. At the far end is Dr. Kane Leighton, a research fellow and lecturer at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies at the University of Tasmania. Between them is Dr. Laura Parker, who's an Indigenous Scientia, is that how you pronounce it? Scientia, senior lecturer and ARC Dacia Fellow in the School of Biological, Earth and Environmental Sciences at UNSW, or as I described her on the flyer, an oyster person. And then online we have Helen Barclay, Managing Director of EnviroDNA, a wonderful ecotechnology innovation company. So Vicky, I thought we might start with you, if that's okay. I wanted to kick off by asking you to kind of set the global scene for where we are now. Late last year, world leaders met in Glasgow for COP26, as I think we have all heard many times, under, of course, the United Kingdom's presidency. We know the term COP, but I'm pretty sure some of us don't really know exactly what it is, to tell you the truth. So I'm wondering if you could explain sort of what happened at the Glasgow Climate Conference and what the major outcomes were.
I'm delighted to, and thank you very much for inviting me to join this great panel. And can I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today, to their elders past and present and emerging. Maybe I should start there. COP26, Committee of Parties, part of the UN machinery to look at the climate agenda. Climate change has been a top British foreign policy priority for a number of years now. It started long before the year of our presidency by going for having the presidency, because in Britain for a number of years it has been a bipartisan agenda. Whichever of our main parties, climate is something that we agreed on. And I think that was a significant shift, really starting under David Cameron's prime ministership. That's why it hasn't been a difficult political issue in Britain. And that is why it is a top British foreign policy priority, because it is one of the great global agendas of our time. It is probably the greatest threat to our planet and life on our planet as we know it. So if I can go to what happened in Glasgow, and bear in mind we were organizing this and starting the process at probably the worst possible time, at the height of the global pandemic. But our determination to deliver it and have it as an in-person conference never diminished in terms of our endeavor. And one of the things that we really wanted to have for the first time was an Indigenous forum at one of these summits, because one of the fundamental pillars that we will hear more of is nature-based solutions, which comes back to a lot of Indigenous knowledge on every continent, their understanding of land and water and sea. One of the other key things that I think that happened in Glasgow was, for the first time, an explicit recognition that the interlinked global crisis of climate change and diversity loss, that connection between the two, that for us to recover on climate, we need to recover on biodiversity, on the natural habitat, on our waterways, our water bodies, the ocean, our forests, that you can't have one succeed without the other. And I think that was a significant moment of global recognition, and a number of key initiatives that flowed from Glasgow on that front. And the importance of protecting, conserving, and restoring nature as a key means to meet climate mitigation and adaptation goals. From the simplest example of restoring mangroves, so vital to the oceans, as an example. So we in Britain continue. Our year of presidency is reaching its final couple of months before we hand over to Egypt in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. And I will sort of pick out a couple of things. I have my notes here to make sure that I don't get anything wrong. There were significant achievements on finance, on the number of countries that agreed in the first place to the Glasgow Climate Pact. 197 countries. That is significant. The challenge now in the work that we have been doing since last November is trying to keep people to the promises that they signed up to. Commitments on finance, that the money does come through. Commitments to deliver reforestation, the restoration of natural habitat, in order for us to have any hope of keeping 1.5 degrees live. Pursuing further commitments, working with Egypt towards their presidency of COP27. I think the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use was a significant milestone because it speaks to this very agenda that we're meeting on tonight, to protect and restore forests and critical ecosystems. You know, what we have seen in the last year since Glasgow, of what used to be 1 in 100-year climatic events, are now foreshortened to once every 5-10 years. The number of times we're seeing flooding in this country. If we look at the forest fires that have ravaged Europe, unprecedented temperatures this last summer in Britain, reaching a record 43 degrees that we have never seen before. The urgency of the situation is more than evident. We also saw 140 leaders representing over 90% of the world's forests pledging in the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. You know, that is only 8 short years away. And every year, if we don't make the progress towards that target, is a year closer to not achieving net zero by 2050. And we know from the Pacific Islands, the near neighborhood, the island nations of the world, this is an existential threat. And apart from losing their land mass, the mass migration of climate refugees is a real concern. You know, where do people go? Where will they live? And there is a lot of international work that we're having to do where these island nations are challenging the international legal framework that even if our land disappears, this is still our blue ocean territory, and having recognition for that. 45 nations pledged urgent action and investment to protect nature and shift to more sustainable ways of farming, as well as over 100 countries now signed up to protect at least 30% of the global ocean by 2030. For Britain, you have to walk the talk. We still have a number of dependent territories. They are all island territories. And my point about the work we have been doing for a number of years, one of my previous jobs, I was High Commissioner to New Zealand, cross-accredited to Samoa, but the other hat I had was Governor of Pitcairn. So where we have ocean territories, we have declared all of them marine protected areas. So there are 880,000 square kilometers of the Pacific Ocean that we have made a marine protected territory, encouraging other nations to do likewise, and then looking at how we restore and conserve those marine protected areas. Over 100 countries now support a target to protect at least 30% of the ocean, as I said, by 2030. And at COP26, we welcomed new supporters, Bahrain. We often don't think of the Middle East as a region with oceans, but of course they do have vital oceans in that northwest corner of the Indian Ocean. The Gambia, Georgia, India, Jamaica, Qatar, Samoa, Saudi Arabia, Sri Lanka, St. Lucia, Tonga, and now, I'm pleased to say, Australia have signed up to that as well. So that's our international lobbying. There is much more, but I hope that gives you a flavour of the real things that we have achieved almost a year ago in Glasgow, and that we're working to make sure we consolidate and translate words and commitments into real traction and delivery and implementation.
Thank you so much, Vicky. I'm wondering if, what do you think catalyzed that change that suddenly brought climate mitigation into close relationship with nature preservation, with biodiversity conservation?
It's quite simple because the science took us there. The work of ecologists, environmentalists, scientists, the research that has been done across this planet in different geographic zones, the commonality of the analysis and the findings. And you can't argue with the facts. And I think our job at Glasgow was to corral all of that, present it, persuade, working with like-minded partners, and of course the UN machinery itself, because it was a UN summit, to convince the leaders that came, to persuade the leaders to come, to confront them, to challenge them, to work pincer-like with other partners to get those we needed over the line, not least this country, if I may say so, which was difficult and hard work, and I still have the bruises to show for it. But it was important work to do.
Thank you, Vicky, and thank you for that work. As you're talking, I do have a beautiful image in my head about this amazing network of people, all around the planet. Most of whom, I will never know. Certainly, most of whom may not be well known, even in their own countries, but all contributing to this huge shift and deeply important shift.
What I would say is that we leveraged our global diplomatic network. We are represented in 178 countries. So with my colleagues across that global network, we were identifying the partners, the people who wanted to work with us, many of them the governments themselves, the NGOs, civil society, business and industry, and taking big business to Glasgow to say that, governments alone can't do this. Business and industry have to look at their own net zero targets, how they transition their own companies, particularly those in the extractive industry. If we're to transition to a new green growth agenda, you need business and industry to play their part. You need the energy companies to become green, renewable energy companies. Current fossil fuel companies have to look at what their shareholders globally are telling them and to make that transition, to make the investments in the new technologies of the future. So that was a vital pillar of our agenda as well.
Thanks, Vicky. We're going to come back to business again a little bit later in the panel, but I'm going to jump across to Kane, who, of course, first of all, because I want to dive into the ocean, this kind of get our heads into this space that is one of the most, significant locations that we need to be thinking about. And Kane is, of course, one of those research scientists doing the kind of work that Vicky has just been talking about. So Kane, we've heard a lot, I think, in Australia in sort of the popular imagination about the Great Barrier Reef and the impacts of climate change on the Great Barrier Reef and efforts to care and restore for corals off the coast of Queensland. But of course, you work on a different reef, the Great Southern Reef, which I believe has there's sort of a competition, isn't there? A little bit, a hidden competition perhaps, but I don't know, maybe that's not the right words. But
if it's a competition, we're losing drastically.
Absolutely. But maybe can you tell us about like where you work, the Great Southern Reef, study what you're doing there, and what you're seeing there in terms of the impacts of climate change?
Yeah. So thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me and thank you for coming. The Great Southern Reef is this spectacular temperate reef system we have in southern Australia. So many Australians are very aware and very proud of the Great Barrier Reef, rightly so. But just like the Great Barrier Reef, we have this amazing, like I said, this cold water reef system in southern Australia. It's 4 times as long as the Great Barrier Reef. It's 8,000 kilometres long. It stretches from the Queensland-New South Wales border, south all the way down New South Wales, around Tasmania, where I'm based, across the south coast of the continent and then up to a similar latitude in WA. And it's this spectacular environment it's a global biodiversity hotspot. It's also a global endemism hotspot. And by endemism, I mean uniqueness, right? So many of the organisms that live there occur nowhere else in the world. So talking a little bit about those global responsibilities that came up at COP, for example, we have a responsibility to look after the Great Southern Reef for Australians, but also globally, because what occurs there occurs nowhere else. And the foundation of the Great Southern Reef is kelp forests and seaweed, but especially kelp forests. And kelp are just a type or a group of seaweeds, a bit like you might say pine forests or wattles. It's similar. They're effectively big brown habitat-forming seaweeds. So pretty much, many of the seaweeds you're familiar with on the beach will be kelp. And that's what I study, the function and the resilience of those ecosystems and the way they especially respond to human-caused stresses and especially climate change. And not only that, but increasingly using that ecological knowledge as a way to go in and potentially manage and restore these environments. So actively intervene to kind of help them be more resilient and also try to stop and reverse some of those declines that we're seeing. Many of which are very significant and are, unfortunately, the Great Southern Reef is just as under threat as the Great Barrier Reef, despite it not getting anywhere near as much attention. And for example, in Tasmania, we've lost about 95% of our giant kelp forests. And that's since about the 1970s, so incredibly early losses. And these forests are true underwater forests. That's actually a giant kelp forest on the screen there. So they can be, 5, 6, 7 stories tall. So when you leave the building tonight, turn around and have a look at the building and imagine an underwater forest that tall. It'll be so thick in places you can't swim through them. Really incredible magical environments and like I said, we've seen 95% declines in those because of climate change and changing oceanography and increasing water temperatures in Tasmania. This is actually a slightly different species of kelp. This is called the golden kelp, and it's the most widespread species on the Great Southern Reef. It really is the Great Southern Reef. If you had to link it to one species, it's golden kelp, which is this the most gold kind of, I guess, seaweed you can see in this photo. But, I mean, what immediately jumps out to me, at least, is the diversity of shapes and colours that you see there. And Southern Australia especially is a real global hotspot for seaweeds. And in fact, it's actually effectively the Amazon, but for seaweeds. We have more species here in Southern Australia than anywhere else in the world, the vast majority of which occur nowhere else in the world. So again, globally, we have this incredibly unique environment right on our doorstep that, is really massively understudied and massively undervalued. Hugely economically important to Australia as well. In fact, more economically important than the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Southern Reef generates about $10 billion a year to the Australian economy, and that's just direct benefits in terms of supporting coastal fisheries, such as abalone, the rock lobster, 2 of our most valuable fisheries in Australia, improving water quality, coastal tourism, stuff like that. So, a really incredible environment. I'm very lucky to be able to work there, but unfortunately it really is To use a poor phrase, I guess, it really is at the coalface of climate change, and we are studying forests that have declined in just the time I've been working there. They've declined since last summer. So yeah, it can be pretty sobering sometimes.
Thanks, Kane. Yeah, I always, whenever I tried to contact Kane to talk about the panel, he would say something great like, I can't talk to you on Wednesday because I'm going to be underwater down in the kelp forest, which sounded so romantic. But when I hear you talk about it in this way, I know it must also be quite heartbreaking, actually, to go and visit these environments when you know what they should be like, but are struggling.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work recently looking at giant kelp forests and looking at the different organisms that live in them, because we lost them so fast and these environments have been so understudied and undervalued. We really don't know what actually makes a giant kelp forest special and how it, for example, is different from a common kelp forest or a golden kelp forest. So we've been doing a lot of work, and I've been working with a student who's doing a lot of research in that area, and we got to dive in some of these last real remnant locations down in far southern Tasmania, and they were absolutely buzzing after they got off after the dive, and rightly so. You know, they're very magical environments, but for me it was, yeah, again, quite sobering and saddening thinking that most of Tasmania's coast used to be like that. You know, areas so thick that you couldn't drive a boat through them. I mean, they used to cut channels through the kelp. And we're not talking colonial times, we're not talking hundreds of years ago. We're talking when many of us were alive in this room, you know, late last millennia, really.
Yeah, it's terrifyingly fast, isn't it? It's not like, suddenly we wake up one morning and they're gone. I noticed we've got another slide I wanted to show. I just loved the mystery fish. Can you explain this a little bit?
So again, I guess the first thing that jumps out to me, again, I'm a seaweed nerd, so I apologise, that's the first thing I always talk about. Most people like the fish. But again, the shapes and the colours and the varieties. And this isn't some spectacular, magical, kind of unique dive location, I guess. This is what you see pretty much every dive on the Great Southern Reef. But this is a photo I took just on a random weekend dive I was doing, and I'm pretty good with despite being a seaweed fan, I'm pretty good with my fish identification skills. And I saw this fish in the middle and had never seen it before and thought, I'll take a photo of it. Went home and looked in the guidebooks, couldn't find it. Did some scouring on the internet, couldn't find it. Managed to email the world expert on box fish, which is what this type of fish is. A researcher from Japan, you know, the wonders of the internet, you can talk to someone like that. And they said, look, yeah, this is I think it's a black barred pygmy boxfish. To their knowledge, this is the first time it's ever been seen in its natural habitat. The species has only ever been known from being washed up on beaches after storms or from being caught in deep sea nets during fishing. It's also never been seen in Tasmania before. It's never been seen this shallow before. So, you know, this is what, again, it kind of highlights to me that unknownness and that real magic of the Great Southern Reef, and that you can go out on a weekend dive and see a fish that has never pretty much been seen alive by human eyes before, as far as we know. Yeah, an incredibly magical environment, and just I think this picture to me really captures a lot of that mystery, and that it's this big kind of black box to work in, and that's why it's in a really exciting intellectual space to work in as well, because so much is unknown. You know, talking about the comparison with the Great Barrier Reef before, the last time the figures were crunched officially, we received about 1% of the funding that the Great Barrier Reef receives, but actually due to the massive influx of funding that the Great Barrier Reef has recently received, back of the envelope calculations, that's more like 0.1% now, despite it being on, you know, all of our doorstep, really. The paper here, the paper in Hobart, where I'm based, will more readily run a story on the Great Barrier Reef than they will on the Great Southern Reef, and the Great Southern Reef is right here. You drive an hour and a half to Bateman's Bay and that's the Great Southern Reef. It's within 50 kilometres of 70% of Australia's population. Pretty much all of our big cities is on the doorstep of the Great Southern Reef, but massively unknown, massively underappreciated.
Thanks, Kane. Honestly, I recognise well kelp on the beach down at Bateman's Bay, but I honestly never understood that it was part of that reef system. I'm going to look at it in a whole new way. I think what's really interesting is you're talking about how, you know, there are so much we don't know about that reef, and it makes me keen to talk now with Laura, who also works on a kind of saltwater species, but one, of course, that we think we know really well, even though we don't. Laura, tell us about your work and how you got into it, because I think when we talked, what really struck me was when you got into your current kind of field of research, it was already in the context of climate change. It wasn't that you had come to it before climate change and climate impacts became sort of front of mind that was already part of your thinking when you got into the field?
Yeah, again, thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for being here. So I first began working on oysters at the beginning of my PhD. I had previously done research on barnacles at that stage, which I really loved. They're really quite amazing, and they're bioindicators of change in the environment. So things that we see happening to barnacles are indicative of things that we expect to happen for the environment. But one thing I noticed quite quickly at that point is that whenever I told anyone what I did, I was instantly followed up with, "What's a barnacle?" And no one really cared whatsoever. So when it came to working on my PhD, I really wanted to pick an organism that was equally as important for the environment, but the people would actually care about if something did happen to them, so that they would listen to the research. And that's what drew me to oysters. So when I did start working on them, there was really not a lot known in terms of climate change impacts. This was back in 2006. And there were, maybe one or two papers that had shown that organisms that grow shells or structures that are made from calcium carbonate, that they might be vulnerable over this century because of a process known as ocean acidification. So this is where our oceans absorb large amounts of the carbon dioxide that's being released into the atmosphere. And once it's absorbed, it changes the chemistry of the ocean and causes the pH of the ocean to drop. So at that point in time, my supervisor and I decided, well, let's have a look whether oysters might be impacted by this ocean acidification. And we combine that with ocean warming because both of those are occurring together. So that's really where our journey first began, working with oysters and climate change.
We're going to come back and hear some more about oysters. I'm looking forward to this. But I wanted to jump to Helen, if she's there in the background and is going to come online. Because I think one of the themes that's sort of coming out of our discussion so far is very much, like one of the major kind of things we're struggling with is even just knowing what is going on. That's the sort of foundation of then being able to make decisions about how to act, particularly in a world in which, resources are not infinite. Resources as in financial resources as well as all the other resources. So, Helen, I know you've been working with EnviroDNA on new technological approaches to surveying and monitoring our inland waterways, to jump inland. So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about what EnviroDNA is doing and having developed this kind of new technology around eDNA, and how you've been working with doing that in terms of surveying platypus and why platypus have been important in that process.
Sure. Thanks, Kirsten. And I would love to be there face-to-face with you all. But I have two sick daughters and myself, I'm also sick. So you're probably glad to keep me in Victoria. So thank you for having me online. I can't see the panel right now, but I can hear you. So I will just talk and just, I guess, interrupt me, Kirsten, if you need. I guess I'm coming into this conversation from, I guess the angle of the importance of innovative technology, innovation, when it comes to solutions and trying to tackle these, crises that we're facing as a global community. And in particular, we're working in the space of environmental DNA. So this is an innovative technology for detecting wildlife and mapping biodiversity. And there's many other, innovative technologies out there in this whole space of, trying to come up with solutions. I was actually only reading about drones, for example, that can now drop seed pods and, expedite reforestation efforts. But yes, our technology, eDNA, is in the space of measuring biodiversity. And the idea is that if we want to manage biodiversity, and inform restoration efforts, for example, we need to know where it is, what it is, how it's tracking, and we need tools to be able to do that. And eDNA is one of those. So the idea is that all organisms, us included, are shedding DNA into our surrounding environment. So things like hair, skin cells, feces, fish scales, you name it, that has DNA in it. And the technology is about taking an environmental sample So I think the next slide gives an example of where you might find DNA in the environment, and we can take an environmental sample, extract the DNA, and then determine what species left that DNA behind. So it's a bit like, CSI when we're out there trying to find platypus as one example species, or a whole range of different species that we're looking for. We work a lot in freshwater systems. We've done a lot in Victoria and New South Wales. But it's a technology that can be used in terrestrial systems. You could be looking at soil, for example. You could be looking at, say, you can see a scat there, which is, for those that don't know what a scat is, it's basically animal feces that you might find, say, a fox scat. And you can extract DNA from that fox scat, and you can work out what that fox has been eating. So you can do diet analysis just by picking up, little bits of DNA that have come through the digestive system of that animal. You could also do that, say, with mosquitoes, and extracting blood and looking at the DNA of the animals that mosquito's been feeding on, or pollen from a flower. What pollinators have come to visit that particular flower. There's a whole range of different types of environmental samples. But the exciting thing, I think, from a water perspective is that water and, waterways, freshwater systems particularly, are like, sinks, if you like, of DNA soup of a surrounding region. So when we're taking samples from a river system, we're picking up a whole range of, fish species, even platypus species, crustacean species, and other terrestrial type animals that might be drinking from that area or living in the surrounding area. And their DNA washes down into this soup of DNA that is the river system, for example. So that's just to give you a bit of an idea about what eDNA is. And to explain, I guess, you might be thinking, God, who's going to be using this sort of tool, and how did it happen before? So the next slide, I'm not sure if it's going to work, is a video. Maybe it hasn't worked. So, no, sorry, I'm getting out of order. So this is an example of how we can take a water sample. So it's very, technical in terms of you need molecular skill sets back in a laboratory to extract the DNA and analyse it and figure out whose DNA it belongs to. But when it comes to actually sampling the waterways, we've developed this system, which you can see in front of you, that is straightforward enough that anyone can go and be taking a sample from their waterways. So we work a lot with citizen scientists, essentially, and even school kids to get out there and be sampling and figuring out what's beneath the waters, which we can't easily see all the time. And in terms of how we came to, using and developing eDNA, it started with some of my colleagues who were surveying platypus. They'd spent years and years conducting trapping surveys. So where you set a net, and if there is a video, I'm not sure if that's up on the screen. It's just a short little video that might not be working, that demonstrates basically a pike net survey for platypus. So what happens traditionally when you're looking for platypus, you go to a waterway, set up 2 nets at one waterway, go to the next waterway, set up another 2 nets upstream, downstream, go to another one, and you might set up nets across, say, 5 or 6 waterways for a night. And then you're out all night checking those nets and seeing whether you've detected a platypus. So it's quite laborious. You have to be nocturnal yourself. And often it's a very fruitless exercise because platypus are notoriously elusive. And even if they may be present in that waterway, it's very likely that you won't actually have the amazing chance of capturing them in a net and getting to see it for yourself. So we thought there must be a better way, or we wanted to find if there was another way that we could be mapping the population of platypus. And that's where we came across this idea of eDNA and found that to get to a 95% chance of detecting a platypus if it's present in that waterway, you just need 2 eDNA water samples, like what you just saw before. Whereas to get to that level of detectability using a traditional trapping method, you would actually need 6 to 10 nights of trapping to get to that level of probability of detection. So it means it's a method that is a lot more efficient in some situations, in many situations, particularly around waterways, of detecting and mapping different species and ultimately biodiversity. And it's enabling us to map biodiversity at scale, which I think is a super important piece of the puzzle. When we're looking at this matter of mass nature loss and biodiversity loss across the globe, we need to be able to quantify it, even though it is challenging, even with tools like this. We need to be able to measure it and monitor it so we can understand if we're making a difference, so we can understand if it's in, crises in certain areas and we need to, throw restoration efforts at it. So this is just an example of a tool that is trying to provide that extremely important data in an efficient way and in a more sensitive way in many cases.
Thanks so much, Helen. Having recently spent a number of very cold evenings along the Molonglo River trying to participate in the local platypus survey, I must admit, I was thinking when we were talking about it, I thought, it is very nice to sit by the river for 2 hours, but not so much on a cold winter evening in Canberra, and more strength to eDNA. We're going to come back and hear some more about where that technology might go into the future. But before we do that, I wanted to come back, because I think the conversation moving from this question about understanding what's going on to efforts that are being made in many different ways to really develop restoration programs, to try and take what knowledge we have and apply those in a way that can help biodiversity respond and withstand climate change, and of course therefore help ourselves. So Vicky, I wanted to come back to you and get you to talk a bit about the Blue Planet Fund, which I understand was one outcome close to your heart that came post the Glasgow COP.
Well, I think its very title, the Blue Planet Fund, recognises that this planet is also a blue one of water bodies and oceans. So the British government committed to establishing this £500 million Blue Planet Fund. We'd like to grow it, so that was the starting proposition. We financed it from our own official development assistance budget, and we have invited others to join us to grow it. It will help eligible countries reduce poverty, protect, and sustainably manage their marine resources and address human-generated threats across 4 key themes: biodiversity, climate change, of course, marine pollution, and sustainable seafood. We realize that for many ocean economies, if we don't get this right, also the guardianship of their marine environment is fundamental. We know that for many small island nations, the sea offers them their livelihood, their living, their food, their sustenance. But how can that coexist with the great challenges that we're facing? The question that I was dying to ask is, why has 90% of the giant kelp forest disappeared? What has caused that to happen? No doubt marine pollution and what flows off land into waterways and then gets discharged into the sea, the way factory fishing fleets that harvest and disrupt the ecosystem of the oceans. So this is to understand what those effects are, whilst also trying to support island nations, particularly developing ones, have a sustainable solution and marine economy. So that's what the Blue Planet Fund seeks to do, the balance between sustainability, restoration, protecting the marine environment, but also providing sustainable livelihoods for small island economies that have, very little alternative.
Is there one sort of project within that really sticks in your mind as like an example about how that's rolling out in a successful way?
There are lots of examples. There isn't one that I've personally been involved in, but the other hat I wear from being High Commissioner to Australia is the head of our Oceania network. So our diplomatic missions across the Pacific Islands report in to me. And I know that the team, our High Commissioners and teams across the 6 island nations in the Pacific that we have a presence in with cross accreditations to others, are drawing on this fund, working with local governments and communities, most importantly, on how we can expend this funding to help them in developing projects that we want informed by the communities themselves. This is not about a big donor coming saying, we'll give you one of these. What we want is to hear what the communities whose livelihoods and future existence depends on protecting their marine environment. So I think that's the thing that I attach greatest importance to, that is co-creation with funding, but you have to listen to the communities themselves who actually understand what is happening because they are feeling its direct effects.
Thanks, Vicky. And I'm going to come back to Kane to talk some more about the 95%, because I think when we come to talk about kelp restoration, but I'm just conscious. I mean, Laura, you're working on a project. Your research is about the conjunction between oysters, between an industry, the oyster industry. You know, that we don't think about Australia really as a kind of oceanic economy. I don't think, but maybe because I come from an inland city. But I think this kind of question about you're engaging at this kind of conjunction of science, of conservation, but also of the industry, of kind of the oyster industry, and the fact that when I told someone about your project recently and mentioned that I talked to you, he went like, "Oh, oysters, but I love eating oysters." Like that was the major kind of issue. So would you like to tell us about sort of the next step in your work? What are you actually doing? What are you kind of working with oyster populations to attempt to support both the industry and the species into the future?
Yeah, so I guess our early research found that, like many marine organisms, oysters are highly vulnerable to our climate change stresses. They find it very difficult to grow their shells. When they do grow their shells, many of them have abnormalities that lead them more prone to things such as predation and disease. And they get a change in a range of their physiological traits. So we see changes in their blood, so the actual pH of their blood drops, and then this leads to all other changes in their body. So what we're really focused on is trying to reduce those impacts so that we can protect the natural environment, but also oyster aquaculture here in Australia. So the species that we work on predominantly, that was on the previous slide, that's the Sydney rock oyster. And I don't know if anyone likes to eat oysters, but this is one of our major edible oyster species here in Australia. It's endemic to Australia, so it's found from the New South Wales-Victoria border all the way up and around to Shark Bay in Western Australia. And in New South Wales, it forms the oldest and largest aquaculture industry, so it's worth approximately $50 million each year. Because of this and because of their importance in the environment, we've really shifted the focus of our research beyond identifying how these oysters will be impacted by climate change to now looking at ways that we can breed the oysters that are more resilient. So some of the things that we're doing are, we've got 2 breeding programs that we're doing in collaboration with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. The first breeding program is what's known as pair-mated breeding. So this is where we get a single male oyster and a single female oyster, and we breed those together to produce what's known as a pair-mated family line. So currently we've got around 200 of these pair-mated family lines that have been produced, and they're really unique for us because each of them has different genetics from one another. So we can go through in the hatchery and expose these oysters, these family lines, to our climate change stresses, and we can look at which of them has the genes that allow them to do better. And from this, we're able to breed them to go into oyster aquaculture, but also to start putting them out into the environment to protect some of those populations in the environment as well.
Thanks, Laura. I was really, I guess when I first talked to you, I thought like, oh, Laura will be out in the, out in the river or out in the estuary, out in the ocean. But most of your work is in the lab, is that right? It's really looking at that sort of controlled breeding experiments that really happens in a very controlled environment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So my life is not too glamorous. I wear gumboots most of the time, and I'm in a hatchery. One of those pictures there shows kind of the large-scale experiments that we do. So we have a really big hatchery. At any time, we may have about 4,000 adult oysters in our tanks. And we exposed, when we're working on adults, we expose them for around 3 months to the climate change stresses before we start to look at how they're responding. And then in this figure, that's an example of the setup that we have when we work on oyster babies or oyster larvae. So the oysters spend around the first 3 to 4 weeks of their life swimming around in the water column. And during this time, they change shapes 3 times. So they start off as what's called a D villager, so they're a D shape. And then they change another 2 times. And the last larval stage, they develop what's known as an eye spot. So it's just a black spot that allows them to detect light in the water column. So that's how they know whereabouts in the water column that they'll settle out on eventually. And they also have what's known as a sticky foot, which is really cool to look at when you're looking under the microscope. It's just this thing that they stick out and they use to crawl around and find the best place for them to settle. All of our experiments are done in the hatchery. Next year we've got kind of a really exciting time in our research where we'll start ground truthing what we are finding in the hatchery out into the field. So we're going to start deploying some of these more resilient families out in the field and see whether they do have the potential to survive and grow and develop better out in the field.
And Laura, I remember I was really interested to hear you talk about that you came to this from a kind of university research perspective, but you're working very closely with the relevant government departments who are responsible for, I'm assuming it's New South Wales fisheries, is that correct?
That's right.
So, and I was kind of curious, like, how did they respond to you when you first turned up and said, I'd like to do kind of these oyster experiments? Was that something that they already had in their kind of thinking, like we need to kind of increase our research in this area around climate change mitigation, or was this kind of something a bit out of left field for them?
It was very much out of left field. So I went and spoke to the head of the mollusk hatchery at the Port Stephens Fisheries Institute, who had done a range of experiments on oysters and looking at other environmental stresses that they face currently in the ocean. So I kind of went there and said, look, I'm really interested in this. I think there could be impacts on oysters. At the time, my collaborator, who is just brilliant, he said, look, I don't know whether it's going to affect them, but I'm happy for you to test it. Let's see what happens. We started working together, I think I mentioned before, back in 2006, and we've kept working this whole time and now looking at how we can overcome these effects. So they've been fantastic every step of the way.
That's great to hear, isn't it, really? Government departments are not always renowned for being very flexible and kind of open to new approaches. I never said that, should I? Okay, and I want to talk now about your work around thinking about kelp restoration. Obviously a very different kind of environment you're working in, perhaps. I don't know. I'm sure you're also doing work more in controlled environments, I understand. But perhaps you could jump off a little bit, just responding to Vicky's question about talking a little bit more about why kelp is disappearing so quickly and how that is sort of feeding into your research about potential for restoring those forests.
Yeah, this all ties in perfectly, actually, so it's what a good segue. So the reason we've lost 95% of our giant kelp over the past several decades is because of climate change and specifically the strengthening of the East Australian current. So you might be familiar with Finding Nemo, the current that the turtles surf on down the coast of Eastern Australia. It's called the EAC, and it's a warm, nutrient-poor current, and it's getting stronger with climate change. We're not really sure why, to be honest, but it's increasing in intensity and strength with climate change, and it's bringing its warm, nutrient-poor water further south than it did historically into places like Tasmania, and displacing the water in Tassie that was more characteristic of the Southern Ocean, so cool and nutrient-rich. And it's those cool, nutrient-rich conditions that giant kelp really love. So it's direct impacts of ocean warming, but also the reductions in coastal nutrients. which is quite unusual because often in many places around the world, kelp is being lost because of increases in coastal nutrients and runoff and pollution. But in this instance, it's a reduction in natural nutrient levels. So because these losses have been so dire, we did start to consider, look, can we intervene and kind of start to actively manage these environments and go out and actually try to restore them? And based on first principles, any restoration efforts, whether or not it happens on land or in ocean, you have to, the first thing to really overcome or understand is what's causing the loss of that habitat in the first place. And you really have to stop it, ideally, or at least overcome it. So you can imagine if you wanted to plant seedlings in a forest and it was being logged, obviously there's no point restoring that environment if it's being logged. In the case of the giant kelp, unfortunately, that's climate change and ocean warming, and they're not things we can really fix in the short to medium term, the time scale that our restoration is happening at. So we took a little bit of a reverse approach and thought, well, can we help the kelp be more adapted to these modern conditions that we've created? So we went and sampled from a whole bunch of the populations from that remaining 5%. And we were looking for whether or not there were individuals, natural individuals that were just more tolerant of those warm conditions. And we've actually found them. About 10 to 15% of the family lines that we tested and that we selected and sampled from the field demonstrate natural increased tolerance to warm water. So it's the same way that some humans are taller than others. Some giant kelp is just more tolerant to warm water. So we haven't genetically modified them or bred them even at all yet. It's just harnessing that natural variation. And they're the individuals that we're replanting back into the ocean in a lot of our trials to give them a little bit of a leg up, to really help them try to cope with a lot of that increased stress. So yeah, it ties into a lot of what we're doing. I mean, what we're doing is at a very basic kind of like a bucket chemistry kind of approach, rather than a lot of the really high-tech stuff that's happening in a lot of fisheries and aquaculture and horticulture, right? I mean, selective breeding has been happening on land for thousands, tens of thousands of years. So we're really just starting to get into that as a way to kind of harness some of that natural variation to help with our restoration efforts and try to overcome that initial reason that we're losing our giant kelp forests.
Thanks, Ken. It really strikes me about the way that we don't think about farming the underwater world. We don't, the same that we've thought about, engaging with plant species, for example, on land for, as you say, thousands of years, really. But to think about the underwater world in that way is a very different approach. And I know you've been working with traditional owners down in Tasmania, Palawa people, about their kind of knowledge of the ocean and oceanic species. And how has that sort of influenced and shaped your work?
Yeah, so one of the restoration sites we're working at was selected by an Indigenous community that we work with, the Wehner community on Bruny Island. And they have, in this specific region, obviously, a very long history, thousands of years of social and cultural and scientific knowledge and memory of these bays and these waterways and the loss of kelp forest, which again has happened over just single generations. And so they heard about the project and they heard that we were looking for potential sites, and they got in touch and said, look, could you help us, could we select a trial site for you where we know there used to be giant kelp, and could we form this partnership where we actually help them restore some of their sea country? And so we're doing that at the moment, and then the plan is once we kind of nail down a lot of the methods and are happy that we can be successful with our plantings, because they work many times but they also don't work often. It's certainly not guaranteed success at the moment. The idea is that we give that knowledge back to the community as kind of a way of respecting and also acknowledging all the knowledge that they have given us in return at the start of the project. And the idea is that the community is very willing to work with science and the scientific institutes, but they're aware that we're all working on 1 or 2 or 3 year lifespan, project lifespans, and when that funding runs out, the scientists will go elsewhere, and the community has asked, well, what's really in it for us? So that was the idea behind us actually training them up to be able to cultivate in the lab and then also outplant their own kelp, with the idea that we can give them that resiliency and that autonomy, and they can go and do with that what they want to do, whether or not that's restoration or potentially kelp farming, like you mentioned too.
Thanks, Kane. And Laura, I know that you're also working with traditional owners up at Pumicestone Passage, the Gubbi Gubbi elders up there, and looking at not so much oysters for aquaculture, but oysters for reef restoration. Can you tell us a bit about that? I'm just going to flip forward on the sides because I've got them out of order.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's so interesting hearing about your stuff came. So oysters, once formed, I guess is a little bit of a background, reef-like structures along the east and south coast of Australia. So they're really abundant. It's areas where oysters are in dense aggregations where they settle on top of one another over many years, and you get these huge, almost rock-like reef structures. And they're really important areas, providing habitat for other organisms in the environment, filtering the water column and protecting the shoreline from erosion. Unfortunately, I guess like the kelp, these oyster reefs have been decimated, and we're basically in Australia at a point where they're classed as being functionally extinct. So there's less than 1% of that original kind of biodiversity, that oyster reef biomass remaining. So in the Pumice Passage, this is one region where there used to be a lot of these oyster reefs, and for the traditional custodians of that region, they relied really heavily on the oyster reefs. They have that rich culture surrounding them. Unfortunately, because of that decimation, it's really led the traditional owners to kind of lose that connection to country in that region in terms of their oyster reefs. And in response to this, they've got an aspiration of trying to restore them. So we began working with the Kabi Kabi people in the Pumice Passage when we heard about this. For us, from a climate change perspective, the Pumice Passage represents an area that is 4 degrees warmer than where we're breeding oysters for on the southeast coast of Australia. So it's a really unique location for us to be testing our oysters to see whether they have that greater resilience to ocean warming, to climate change. But it also allows us to use oysters that may have greater capacity to survive in that region. So we're working in collaboration with the traditional custodians to try and restore oyster reefs, testing our oysters out in that region.
Thanks, Laura. I really want to hear it. Come back next year. I want to hear again about how that's going, how that's unfolding. One of the things I wanted to pick up on, this question about sort of funding, Kane, you were raising it, this kind of question about funding projects, and I think one of the interesting things that sort of I'm beginning to understand is a shift in thinking that this work can be funded and can be developed not just through grants and through kind of research funding, but that this kind of question of engaging with biodiversity and climate action was also moving to kind of become part of thinking about business and finance. And Helen, I might jump to you because I know you've got a background actually in business as much as in conservation, and I was really interested to talk with you about the way in which at EnviroDNA you're starting to implement and think through some of these new models of business, this kind of nature positive business model, and how that's changing the way in which we actually think about the relationship between conservation and business. I think traditionally we've always thought about those things as kind of opposite. They can never be happy partners. But the work that you and others are doing is really starting to shift that. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I guess. I'm a believer in business being part of the solution. So, I mean, I'm getting a little bit of feedback there. I don't know if that's causing a problem for you guys, but I can hear audio feedback. Okay, it's gone. Thanks, Luke, in the background. Working through the tech issues. So obviously businesses is a massive part of the issues that we're facing with these global crises, but they need to be part of the solution. And I believe that business can be used as a force for good, and that we need to use business as a force for good, as has already been touched on, throughout other people's comments today. We need to start bringing business into the conversation, and they're a powerful entity. And if we're looking across, we've got not-for-profit organisations that are out there trying to make a difference. We've got community groups out there trying to make a difference. We've got scientists out there trying to make a difference and do the research to inform the actions that we need. We've got governments that sometimes try and make a difference. And the other big piece of that puzzle of, all the pieces of the puzzle in society is business, and business is powerful. And imagine if we can use the power of business to actually create the change that we need to see. So yes, business can be a dirty word, but there are many examples out there now how business is being used as a facility to make good change. And I guess EnviroDNA is just one example. I mean, there's many, many, many examples, and the business that I work for, EnviroDNA, is just one. So the work that we're doing, measuring biodiversity, providing tools, our service that we're offering, is a service to detect biodiversity and therefore inform restoration efforts as one example. And some of the other examples of where eDNA is being provided is in biosecurity, and we're looking at how we could be detecting, threats that are coming into our borders that can impact our agricultural industry, but also our natural environment. So I guess it's just an example of how, the solutions to these problems can be delivered by business. And so that's just one example. And there's a movement that started about 10 years ago called B Corp. And B Corp is to business what fair trade is to coffee. The idea is that, how can you have a good business, and what does it look like? How do you make sure that you're not just thinking about your financial bottom line, you're actually thinking about having an impact in terms of people and community, the people that are working for you, the community that you're working in, and the environment. And so this is this idea of a triple bottom line approach to business. So finance, people, planet, essentially. And B Corp is trying to provide a framework for businesses to think about that. And so, there's hundreds now in Australia. There's possibly even becoming thousands. I haven't looked at the latest numbers of businesses that are saying, we want to be responsible in terms of how we operate, and they get audited, to see if they meet the level of certification of a B Corp. And they can learn through that process about what it is to be a good business that's not just about making money. And in the news this week, many of you probably heard about or read the headline about Patagonia. I've got a slide somewhere there that might be popping up. And this is a $3 billion outdoor apparel company, global company. And that's owned essentially by the guy who started it many decades ago. And he, is coming to the end of his time with this business. And he could have taken the business public, sold it, etc. But instead, he's actually given 98% of his business away to a charity, which is not what I'm saying every single business is going to be doing. But the point is that people that are in business aren't necessarily bad, and he's just a fantastic example of a leading business person that is trying to make change in a significant way and demonstrating the power of business to make that change. So I'm all about using business as a force for good, and I think we need to do it more.
Thanks, Helen. I wanted to then throw back to Vicky and say, I know you touched a little bit on this coming in your opening responses, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit how that thinking is playing sort of in the global arena, but also perhaps what the biggest obstacles are to this interest in, for example, triple bottom line theory. It's not a theory, it's a process, it's an accounting process to becoming more widely adopted.
Well, I think it is, because at the end of the day, businesses have customers and consumers, and it is every man, woman, and child on this planet that will make decisions using their purchase power, if I can put it that way. So many companies, and I think that was one of the things in Glasgow last November, by bringing business in and getting them to commit, but also to highlight that if we're talking about green growth, we're talking about a new global economy. And let's put aside the science, let's put aside the effects of climate, and let's just talk about the bottom line. Because if we can't appeal from a position of altruism and conscience and care for the planet, then you can appeal to the bottom line, that there is actually money to be made. but we have to use all the arguments to appeal for that sort of road to Damascus moment for big business, and I think many have. Bill Gates was there, and he's been a leader in terms of putting the many billions that he has earned to good use. So getting champions like him and others to participate and make the business case to business with the credibility of an authentic business voice was very much part of it. And reminding people that, we're all in this, because if we have one segment of community or the world or business not joining this endeavour, then we all fail. So it's something we called the Glasgow Breakthrough Goals, flagging that, initially this could add 16 trillion American dollars to the global economy. Just in 5 sectors that we identified need to transform. That's power, road transport, hydrogen, steel and agriculture. Just those 5 sectors, never mind everything else. So there is a 16 trillion opportunity out there. And we wanted to showcase companies that are already finding the business opportunity to create new jobs, new industries of the future. And coming back to transport and roads, here's an example. The construction of new roads use some of the hardest to abate materials in concrete, bitumen, steel, and fuel, equating to an average of 100,000 tons of CO2 per mile of highway. So every time we build a new road, this is the climate effect. So we need to find businesses that can come up with more sustainable solutions. And there was a British company that we showcased called MacReba, because they're Scottish, who use plastic bottles in their bitumen mix for roads, with over 100,000 non-recyclable bottles, because not all plastic is recyclable, that they put into their bitumen mix. And that's a more sustainable way. Till we find the new materials of the future, that will come through. So persuading companies to invest in that future, but also showing them that there is real money to be made in new approaches. And if I just use an Australian example of an Australian company that has invested in Britain, Lend-Lease, one of your largest property development companies. When I first met their CEO in 2019, when I first started this job, we were talking about their transition to a sustainable green construction company. And he said when they started on that journey, the cost of a carbon neutral construction was about 24-25% higher than building with traditional building materials. So they needed to transform their supply chain using their purchase power. In the journey that they had taken, the cost had now dropped to below 10%. And on the trajectory, and in developing, because of their purchase power, their supply chain, businesses that were traveling with them, producing new types of building materials that you can sink carbon into and lock it. So you're building a building that actually helps with carbon capture and things like that, that they anticipated within 5 to 10 years, sustainable green buildings would actually be cheaper to build than traditional materials. And that's a commitment and investment they were making, that it will take time, but if that's our destination, we know we can transform this business, and moreover, we can carry our supply chain and encourage people to come and join us on the journey. And so that's what they're doing now.
That's a pretty amazing example, I have to say. Thank you, Vicky, and incredibly, I feel excited just actually hearing about you talk about that, which is just, where we all would like to go. I have many more questions actually, but I'm conscious time is starting to run a little bit short, and I wanted to give all of you an opportunity to ask a question if you would like to. So if you would like to ask a question, maybe just pop up your hand, and I think our lovely my lovely colleague Luke will run around with a microphone. Please do speak into the microphone. Everybody can hear then, and then it can also become part of the recording of the evening. So does anybody have a question? It's quite hard to see. Yes, up there on the right.
Hi, I'm Dave. I always ask the first question, and that's just so you guys have a little bit more time to think about it, okay? So that's the expectation. So post-2050, it's not only about net zero. To reach 1.5 or 2 degrees, and IPCC says we're not going to get to 1.5 now, but we've actually got to take carbon from the atmosphere. So we've got to go negative. And I reckon one of the issues with private engagement is that the innovations or the solutions aren't out there. And I wonder what particularly the giant kelp forests and other opportunities in the ocean present as an opportunity to go negative carbon rather than just carbon zero, which is what we have to do post 2050 if we're going to keep the temperature under 2 degrees.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, yes, absorbing emissions is absolutely critical to our future combating of climate change. And the world's oceans are getting a lot of attention for their potential to absorb and to help on that kind of negative emissions pathway. Kelp and seaweed especially is getting a lot of attention at the moment. Unfortunately, for that system especially, it's really... the claims that are being made are very far ahead of the science, and they're premature, unfortunately. This idea that kelp or seaweed is the silver bullet that's going to save the world is overhyped and ahead of the science, like I said. That's not to say we have the science to disprove it, we just don't have the science to support those claims. But not only that, I mean, I think everyone's really hunting for the silver bullet at the moment, especially a lot of the business ventures and a lot of the investment firms are looking for those silver bullets, and there's not going to be any. It's going to have to be a collaborative effort across all these different systems. I think there will be aspects of the marine realm that really do help with negative emissions, whether or not that is manipulating environments in certain ways to help them absorb extra carbon, whether or not that's phytoplankton, whether or not that's through more traditional blue carbon or marine carbon habitats, such as salt marsh or seagrass potentially, which the science does support that they're pretty good sequesterers of carbon, that they can lock away a lot of those emissions. But yeah, again, it's going to have to be a plethora of things, and this idea that the ocean's going to save us is not supported by the science.
And Kane, I was really struck when we were talking before, you were saying, you know, there's this idea that kelp is a great carbon capture potential, but actually if you talk about kelp forests, which are different than just kelp by itself, is a different situation in relationship to carbon.
Yeah, so again, you know, seaweed is kind of having its moment in the sun, and it's kind of sexy science at the moment. When I first started my PhD, you know, you'd be at a conference or a party or something, and people would hear you're a marine biologist, and they'd ask, oh, what do you do? And they'd want turtles, sharks or something, and I'd say seaweed, and, you know, their eyes would glaze over. Nowadays, people are like, oh, that's amazing, have you heard about this, have you heard about that? So, yeah, there is a massive amount of hype around it, and I've lost my train of thought.
Kelp.
I just wanted to tell the story because it happens.
It's a very
so
good story. I think I was really surprised, like kelp versus kelp forest.
Yes, sorry, yeah. So all of this attention at the moment is really on seaweed as the individual plant or organism, if you want to think of that, their potential to suck up and sequester carbon. But clearly kelp don't grow in an isolated environment. They are part of a kelp forest. And kelp forests create such amazing, spectacular habitats that are home to a whole bunch of other organisms and a whole bunch of other animals, and animals inherently produce a lot of carbon dioxide. And when you look at that system as a whole, the animals in those kelp forests are often producing more carbon than the kelp are actually absorbing. So some kelp forests at certain times of the year, depending on seasons and local conditions, can actually be net emitters of carbon rather than sequesters of carbon. So that's some of the complexity in these questions that often gets glossed over, I guess, when you get a lot of money and a lot of attention on a topic like seaweed, where, yeah, people are looking for these silver bullet solutions and they overlook, either accidentally or on purpose or whatever, some of the complexities of these systems and the complexities of the science.
It strikes me it's also part of shifting our cultural thinking from thinking about species as sort of technologies that can get applied to thinking actually every species lives in an ecosystem and is only meaningful, in an ecosystem and survives in an ecosystem, and an ecosystem is a different bucket of fish, or if you like, than a technology.
Yeah, and just very quickly on that note, again, so the kelp forest doesn't exist in isolation either, right? So a big concept in carbon sequestration is something called additionality, and the idea is that if let's say you're planting a kelp farm to try to absorb carbon, it doesn't only have to sequester and absorb carbon, it has to do more than the environment it replaced, and that's often a phytoplankton community, floating microalgae, that it can be incredible sequesters of carbon. So that's that whole of system thinking, and that you not only need to think outside of the kelp to the kelp forest, you need to think of that broader system as well.
Great question, thank you. We can go and talk about that for a while. Is there another question out there? Yes, right in the front here.
Hello, my name's Lindy. I have a background in education, also in strategy and defence. My question is for Her Excellency. Regarding the current, and it's actually not to do with oceans, forgive me, the current crisis with the gas problem with Russia for the UK and Germany and other nations around the world, do you think that's promoting or encouraging business to look at alternative forms of energy? Is it actually accelerating that process?
The short answer is yes. Events from Russia's egregious invasion of Ukraine and Russian gas supply, everyone across the continent of Europe is now having to find alternative gas, not to increase gas, but to replace that they used to receive from Russia, so that we can cut off that source of revenue that is being used to fund what Russia's doing. But what I think the majority of European countries, including Britain, is how can we hasten the pace to renewables? So we have a short-term issue where our energy mix has to be adjusted, but the long-term solution is the imperative to transition faster so that we no longer have that dependency. So I think in a silver lining in a very dark cloud is that we will be seeing increased pace on investment into renewables. And if I can just pick up the point, there is no single silver bullet for the global challenge. We are going to have to look at everything from a range of new technologies that haven't even come through yet, or have come through, but the price point is too high. How do you reduce the price through take-up? A very simple example is, for those of us who can remember when the mobile phone came out, very few people could afford one. It was the size of a breeze block. Now you can buy, they're almost disposable. So that's the similar sort of thing that we have to see. A new technology becomes mass-produced and at a price point that we can afford. But we shouldn't take our eye off, equally importantly, nature-based solutions. And whether it's to do with water, the oceans, whether they are kelp forests, wetlands, salt marshes, mangrove projects, we are going to have to do everything across that full spectrum. So how do we do that is the great challenge of the moment, because you're right. Net zero by 2050 is simply the first goal. And with successive COPs to come, including Australia's ambition to host COP 28 or 9, in partnership with the Pacific, each of those future COPs are going to set the agenda for the next decade to come and looking beyond 2050, because it doesn't stop at 2050. We just have to evolve and adapt, and much will depend on what we achieve. And that's why there is such a focus now on the NDCs and renewed ambition for 2030, 2035.
Thanks, Vicky. Another question? One more question I'm getting from Luke. Lucky last. Thanks, Luke.
Hello, my name's Charles. I'd like to congratulate the whole panel for a fantastic effort, as with all the climate scientists in the world that are doing such a great job. You also make mention of industry coming along and joining, and that's on the one thing we're looking forward to increasingly. But there is another catch. The silver bullet is one, if I can just quote Joel Gergis, who is the senior research scientist at ANU, in her book that came out only a few days ago, that there's 144 fossil fuel mines, coal and gas, on the drawing board at the moment that the government is going to approve. Now, my question to you is, what can we do more, and how can we bring the intelligence of all the climate scientists in the world to bear on politicians? Difficult question, I know.
That's a very difficult question, which I don't know if we can cover in this panel. I'm getting some... I think I might actually respond to that, because I think in my role at the museum, and I guess in my life, I feel it's not just about the climate scientists. I think we have to extend the conversation so that it's scientists, but also with all the other areas of work. We really need people across the whole spectrum of professions, I think. I think the science can, help us understand what's happening, can do the research that can enable us to respond to it, but we need policy, we need government programs, we need historians, we need community engagement. One of the areas we were going to get onto if we'd had more time was around kind of working with communities and bringing people of very different backgrounds into this conversation. I feel like what we need is to join the science with the broadest possible public engagement, public force that will provide the kind of capacity for decisions to be made then that are perhaps more difficult in the governmental area to support a better future. I grabbed the last moment. Sorry about that. So we have run out of time. But I do very much wanted to say a few thank yous. First, I'd very much like to thank the British Council for partnering with the National Museum to make this evening's panel discussion a reality, and also the British High Commission for not only providing Vicky, but for assisting with the organisation in a wonderful way. My personal thanks to the James O. Fairfax Foundation, which make it possible for me to be here through their support of the museum. Of course, I'd like to thank the wonderful NMA team for making this, particularly for working so hard today to make it possible for Helen to still be part of the panel. Thank you to all of you for coming along. I think this is what we need to do. Get together, talk, understand, share, and then we can kind of begin to act even more strongly together. But of course, I want to say a really particular heartfelt thank you to the wonderful panel this evening. Kane Leighton from the University of Tasmania, Laura Parker from University of New South Wales, Her Excellency Vicky Tredal, the British High Commissioner to Australia, and Helen Barclay, thank you so much from EnviroDNA for putting up with the sniffles and the techo to kind of come on anyway. We really appreciate you going the extra mile. So that's it for this evening. We'll be hopefully planning some future panel discussions down the track, so stay tuned. And please join me in saying thank you so much to the panelists.